Okay, thank you. That's actually my first XMLPrague this year, and I'm happy to be a speaker on today's track. So my topic today is a bit controversial, or looking into the future about publishing. It's about CSS Paged Media. Perhaps some of you may have heard of that, at least people that are using XSL-FO, Antenna House, and these tools are perhaps interested. I'm basically talking about CSS Paged Media, some techniques, tools, and it's a lot of stuff, and let's start. I'm doing publishing work since about 20 years. I worked for different publishers in Germany in e-publishing departments. Since 11 years, I'm working as freelancer, basically doing Python, SOAP, and Plon development. Plon is a CMS, large enterprise CMS system. And we are basically building large content management system, large web applications, intranets, extranets, and so on. And publishing is kind of pet project. I started my own publishing platform, Prism Publish, some years ago, basically a CMS and being able to generate PDF in high quality from HTML and XML. And actually, CSS Paged Media is around since already almost 10 years, long before we had a working group at the W3C. There was some tool, CSS2XSL-FO, which basically took CSS and generated FO under the hood, and then it could generate PDF and styles from CSS already in 2005 or 6. And I'm not the typical XML guy. For me, XML is data, and it's not a religion, but just as a side note. So let's get started. Who of you are using or working with XSL-FO in the first place? Not generating PDF, okay. So FO is around since 10 years and perhaps a bit longer. And from my point of view, FO is going to die slowly. One indication is that the working group of the W3C abandoned the working group 2 years ago, just because lack of people, according to the XML activity lead, Liam Quinn. I was also doing some research about the future of FO in the eyes of other people. Lots of people say it's too complicated, it's too verbose, and also there seems to be some lack of FO developers on the market. So what's the future? We've seen some publishers moving away from FO. For example, O'Reilly started some years ago projects for doing basically publishing based on HTML and CSS for styling. We see that the vendors like Antenna House or RenderX, providing the exact formatter, are going towards CSS, and so the complete publishing industry seems to move in the direction of CSS. And also we have customers that came from FO-based workflows, and they're looking into other options than FO. So from my point of view, FO is going to die slowly. Anyone to object that? Point taken. We can discuss this tonight, perhaps. So what is CSS Paged Media? Basically, it's a standard or a draft of the W3 working group. It's basically you have a content as XML or HTML. You take the CSS for styling, as you do it with web pages and browsers since 10 or 15 years. Then you throw both into a converter, and in the end, you get a PDF. That's the basic idea of CSS Paged Media. I was talking about HTML, but not XML. I'm at the XML conference, so I'm talking about HTML. Basically, it's 2 reasons. When you look at the available tools, we have 4 or 5 tools on the market doing CSS Paged Media. We have basically 2 big tools. One is PDF Reactor, and other one is Prince XML. They provide the full feature set of the functionality for the typesetting, basically on HTML or HTML5. And getting from XML to HTML as input for the converters is basically either trivial. You usually have some conversions using code, XLT, and so on. So basically, there's always an easy way going from XML to HTML as input. On the other hand, if you want to have native XML processing, here you can always use the display property in CSS. You can say, for example, when you have a tag element, my table, you can give it semantics by using the display property and say, okay, this should be run as a table, or when your cell tag is called my cell, you can just give it the semantics of table cell. So it's basically, there's an easy way for getting from XML into an HTML semantics. Another reason why we're using HTML is JavaScript. JavaScript can be used in these converters for doing some conversions or generating arbitrary indexes, table of contents. I will show that later. When you're using XML as input, you can't use JavaScript because JavaScript provides a DOM, the document object model, and you don't have that in XML. I will give you a few examples about what you can use, which kind of publications can be generated from HTML and CSS. Basically, traditional stuff like newspapers where you have one or multi-columns with images, footnotes, hyphenation, headers and footers, footnotes, and cross-references. In this example, we generated a newspaper for publisher in Germany, basically lots of text, some author information, and in a two-column layout. I have these samples with me. If you're interested later, come to me. I can show you some examples. Or you can go forward to more layout-oriented documents, where you, for example, need absolute positioning of boxes or web-to-print applications, brochures, flyers, or catalogs. I brought one big example of a book that was produced with HTML and CSS. Just give it around and return, please, back to me later. It's pretty heavy. It's a price list of water heaters and so on. Don't ask me. And was completely generated from HTML and CSS, which was taken from SAP databases, CMS. Don't ask me, it wasn't my product, but I have this as an example what you can do with these tools. It's very similar to what Patrick Gundlach did with his tools, basically color production. So the quality of these documents is pretty high. I've been already talking about the tools available for CSS Paged Media. So traditionally, we have something like Antenna House, right? Version is 6.2 with CSS extensions. And I've also seen 1 month ago, XAP is now available as cloud service as under cloudformula.com. So basically, we have tools having some FO background. But we also have some tools which are basically designed and implemented for CSS Paged Media. And here's a list of these tools. We have some open source tools based on Python. Forget this stuff, that's scrap. Then we have something called WK HTML to PDF, strange name. It's based on the WebKit render engine of Google Chrome. It has good quality, it's open source, it's free, in some cases it's okay. And I'm basically talking about Prince XML and PDF Reactor. Perhaps most of you know Prince XML. PDF Reactor is a bit unknown in the publishing world. It's from a company in Germany. So how do you work with CSS in real life? This looks like CSS. The basic thing, when you're doing a publication, you need to adjust the page size. Say it's format A4, S3, or landscape, and so on. And the basic thing is basically you start with a page rule in CSS and say, okay, this document is size A4. You can just adjust the margins as you would do in HTML for styling a website. You have special selectors for example, for left pages and right pages. So you could say, okay, the margin on the left side is 2 centimeters, and on the right side, it's also adjusted to 2 centimeters, and this looks very natural. If you would describe this into FO, you would just have to write more XML and more XML. So that's pretty easy to write, to read. And in particular, if you have a web designer in-house having CSS knowledge, it's very easy to get a person with this background into generating PDF documents that look at least in a reasonable way. One specialty here is something called CSS named pages. For example, if you have a div element with a class special, you can assign it a special name. In this case, you create or bind the special to the page. And for example, in this case, this rule will basically say, okay, all contents of the div special class would be displayed or rendered in color red. Next slide is about the page model or page regions in CSS Paged Media. CSS Paged Media defines several page regions of a page. Of course, you have always the main content slot, and then you have named slots like top left corner, top left, top center, and so on. That's necessary in a case where you want, for example, place counters or content from, let's say, headings into, let's say, the header or the footer, for example. Through CSS, you can add the current content of an H1 or H2 element into the header or the footer or place the page numbers here. In CSS, this looks like this. You can say, for example, on all left pages, the page counter should be placed in the bottom left section. And on all right pages, you want to place the page counter on the right page. Basically, left, right, and then just place the counters inside. Next topic is multi-column layouts. That's typical for publications, especially newspapers. We have content rendered as 1, 2, or 3 columns. And in CSS, that's pretty trivial. You have your content in some div element. And then in your CSS rule, you can say you want 3 columns, and you want that the column width should be 5 centimeters. So in this case, you have column 1, 2, 3. That's basically all the text would be in one div without any separation. And the renderer directly automatically renders this box with 3 columns, and each column being 5 centimeters wide. Hot topic in CSS Paged Media is always images. By default, all converters support the standard image formats like PNG, JPEG, and so on. So basically all raster formats. But also you can use SVG. SVG is preferred format in lots of contexts because usually the SVG images, especially when you have something like graphs or diagrams and so on, they're much smaller, and they basically just scale either for a print PDF or for an online PDF with a low resolution. And all tools basically support SVG. Then we have differences in the converters when you look at the color spaces. RGB is basically supported by all converters, but some tools only support CMYK. For example, PDF Rector and Antenna House support CMYK, but this widely used Prince XML converter only supports RGB. So at this point, you have to decide or look at your requirements of the printer. Can you handle RGB, or do you need to deliver CMYK? So there's also a question you have to look at when you are choosing a particular converter. Images can be placed relative or absolute. I will give you some examples, and you can determine the width or the size of the image by using the width and height properties in CSS. And you can also use CSS3 transformations. For example, in this case, we had a prototype which was kind of an image album for people walking in the woods and so on. We created a prototype where basically people could take images with a picture, upload to a platform, and at the end we would basically generate an automatic image album. So in this case, we have, this would be both pictures of taken in the wild, and then you see the images are a bit rotated. They are placed absolutely, relatively to some magic point in the middle. And you see it's actually looking pretty nice. Unfortunately, the project died, but not of this reason. This example shows you a newspaper for employees of a hospital, also directly generated from CMS content, where we had the blown CMS just maintaining an article content type with text, headline, and then an image per article. And then we have these images have an automatically generated table of contents. But the problem with images is always floating. Especially when you have large images that perhaps don't fit on the bottom of one page, then the page must be perhaps floated on the next page, then have perhaps a gap on the actual page, or you need to adjust the size to some point in order to make the image fit onto the current page. And these tools provide good or bad implemented options for that. It depends on every single tool. The standard way, which is always supported, is that you can define a minimum width and minimum height. Same for the maximum. So you give the converter some hints and rules where you can basically make a decision on if this image should be placed on the current page or not. Another option here is for solving this problem by basically having a good layout where basically the images fit into the flow of the text. Is using JavaScript. At least some of these tools provide a JavaScript API. So at the running process, they could look into the current layout of the document and can perhaps make a decision, okay, if I resize this document by 10 or 20%, it would fit onto the current page instead of creating a half-empty page and then moving the image onto the next page. But this depends on each converter. Tables. All converters support rendering of tables, small tables, large tables, tables with a very wide table. In general, the table model is, as you know it from HTML, you have a head element, a body element, and a footer element. Tables can span multiple pages. And what all converters support is basically that if a table spans more than one page, then the header of the table will be repeated on the next page. Options for example, working with extra wide tables would be, for example, if you know that your table is extra wide, you can give it, for example, in HTML a special CSS class wide or something else, and then make it a named page using page wide table, and then you can adjust, for example, that this particular page containing the table should be rendered at in landscape mode. So you could basically rotate the table through CSS. Or in some cases, you could also apply a CSS3 transformation. We would just say, okay, render this table rotated by 90 degrees. So these tools give you these options, and here's one example from a current project. We have one table spanning 2 pages, and you see that the headers are basically repeated on the next page. That's a table in landscape mode that's rotated using a CSS named page. The table looks like crap, but the input was also crap, so don't complain. Counters are basically used for generating the page counter or the maximum amount of pages, or also typically for generating a table of contents, a number in table of contents. For example, if you have this markup, just simple, you have an H1 tag and two H2 tags, and then a new chapter with the H1, and this should be rendered as first table 1.1, subtitle 1.2, another subtitle, and 2, title 2. So basically, this would be the result. And you can do this with the following CSS rules. For each H1, you have in counter C1, counter 1, which is incremented for every element. So for the first chapter, C1 would be set to 1. For the second H1, it would be set to 2. So basically, you can count 1 to 3 and so on. And of course, for the subsections, you always want to reset the counter for the second level. So that's basically when you encounter an H2 element, this would be incremented as well. And for placing these counters into the table of contents, you can just use the double before selector. Basically, this just instructs the converter to say, okay, if you render an H1 element, just place the value of the counter in its current context before the H1. So basically, this H1 would reference to this one here, and for H2, we have two counters, from the first level and one from the second level, and this would basically generate this two-level deep counter. Another topic always used in especially newspapers or in scientific papers are footnotes. In HTML, you could generate or just create a markup for the footnotes like this, taking spell element, give it a class fn or footnote or whatever. And there is a special standard in the CSS Paged Media standard that would basically float or treat this span as a footnote, and it would basically float into the footer section. And in reality, this would look like this. So we have this footnote. The footnote text would go into the footer section, and you have a counter basically incremented from 1, 2, 3, and so on, just for the footnotes. You could also reset the counters on a per section level in order to have the footnote numbering starting from 1 on each of the pages. Cross-references, not to forget. Usually you want have an option to say, okay, please look in addition this chapter, or look for the particular keyword in section something. This can be done easily. For example, in this case, we have a link element with the class pageref and a link to the anchor figure. And using this CSS statement, it would basically place after this element here, would basically generate this figure, what you see here, on page 22. By using this CSS statement, it basically injects or inserts after this element the content on page, what you see here, and then in addition, it would basically take the current page counter for this element and insert it here. So you can basically generate page numbers or reference other elements in your document. The same can be done using the target content, where you want to fetch or reference text from other elements. For example, you could have a div element with the name figure. In this case, this has the text, this is a figure. And we have the same reference as in the example above. And using the target content function, you could basically inject or replace, in this case, the content of this element will be replaced by C, the string is fixed, and then this target content at a href construct would basically reference to the text above in this element and just invert this into here. This could be, for example, used for generating running headers in the head section, where basically every page of a section has the title of the main title of the main section. Pagination, in good time. Controlling page breaks or pagination is always an issue. For example, we have this markup h1 with the title, and then you could have a div with a subtitle, and then an element containing the content. You can control the page break using something like page break before, always. This means that in the PDF, before every h1 element, a page break would occur. The same could be done, for example, if you imagine you have the title and the subtitle, and want a page break after this, before the main content, you would inject this page break after always into your CSS rule. It would basically generate the title, the subtitle, and then on the new page you would see the content. Then we have something like page break inside avoid. For example, if you have a long list and you want to avoid a page break within the list, you could instruct the converter to avoid this page break. But as the term avoid says, it's a hint, but it's not always guaranteed that it cares about your rules. Also, from the typographical point of view, interesting are handling of hyphenation. All tools support hyphenation in the most common languages. The standard is basically that you put a lang element on some element. For example, in this case, we have a germ element with germ on the tab level, but we also have, you can mix hyphenation by saying, okay, there's some English text and say lang equals en, and then configure hyphenation. I'm skipping a slide about JavaScript. One note on floats. Floats are one of the hot topics right now, and they're treated differently in all converters. There is currently a draft for standard handling floats at W3C. They propose some statements in CSS for basically having floats or having placing elements within columns, either this one or variations on that. Or for doing something in CSS Paged Media right now that's basically impossible, or basically having shapes or exclusions or stuff like that. This would be really hot if we would have this in converters. That would be actually cool. That's basically the missing part right now when I'm working with these tools. Summary of the tools, almost last slide. This slide gives an overview about the existing tools. Commercial tools, as said, we have Prince XML, PDF Rector, and Tinnerhouse. I'm familiar with both tools, Prince XML and PDF Rector. They're basically in the same price range. They have proprietary license, so basically commercial tools. I have very few experience with Tinnerhouse, so basically can't nail me on these points here, but we're using these tools since 4 or 5 years in production, and they're pretty reliable. My personal preference right now is using PDF Rector because this company is in Germany. I know the guys, and talking to the company behind Prince XML is they're launching it in Australia, and there's always a kind of, it takes some time to communicate with them. So limitations of CSS Paged Media. Automatic typesetting is always automatic. This means you have to accept something, design decisions made by the converter. You have limited influence on basically on the typesetting process. You can adjust rules or make some particular rules for a particular use case, for injecting page breaks and so on. But in general, it's automatic typesetting, and it's not the tool that would replace Adobe Indesign, where you could just move your frames around and adjust until it fits, and keep that in mind. And it can be very time-consuming if you're doing a more complex layout for get it right. So the typical use case that we're using these tools are basically either technical documentation, manuals, catalogs. What's the catalog? Okay. Brochures or mass publications, but we basically reach a good quality with these tools. Sometimes it's equivalent to using compared to Adobe Indesign and so on. But for each project or for each publication, you need both knowledge about what these tools can, about limitations, and in order to make a decision about which converter to be used, or even if such an approach is workable with these tools. So this ends my talk. Any questions?
Thank you, Andreas. So I think we can go with some questions, because then there will be panel and there will be more time for questions over there.
Yes, I'm Mike Miller from Antenna House. Need to clarify a few points. One, Antenna House formatter is native CSS. We have an FO formatter, CSS formatter, and we have one that supports both, but it is native CSS.
It's not based, it's not running on the FO engine?
No.
Okay, okay.
No, it's completely native. It's
Okay.
got its own parser built in. It takes the HTML coming in, parses it, goes straight to the formatting engine. It's $5,000, not $7,000. But for $7,000, you get both FO and CSS.
Ah, okay, okay.
But it's $5,000 for one or the other.
Okay, this one's completely clear from the web
Yeah.
page.
And Antenna House is fully committed to FO and CSS.
Okay.
Yeah, you didn't mention one important question about what do you define as page media? There is something like 5 or 6 specifications across the web where it's mentioned page media, and which one are you talking about?
There's, I think there are actually 5 or 6 drafts by the World Web Consortium, the CSS Paged Media working group, and the last revision was 2013, 14. So it's basically the official standard, but all tool vendors have their own extensions for implementing additional functionality. For example, Antenna House has example for generating footnotes in a multi-column layout under each column, for example. That's not a part of the standard. So basically, each vendor has its own little universe around the standard, just for implementing either customer-specific requirements or...
So it's not a standard, and that's what you said?
It's a draft, but with all drafts or standards, there's always a vendor having some particular requirements and doing something on top or doing something different or interpreting the standard in a different way. So
Okay.
that's life.
Oh, thank you. Okay, the last question, and then we'll just proceed to the panel, and there will be other last questions.
Okay, you skipped the slide about JavaScript.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if there is any callback from the typesetting engine with JavaScript, so that you can make decisions that can only be made at processing time.
That's the only question for me, because the first engine that implemented JavaScript was Prince XML, and basically horribly documented, or basically no documentation. And also PFactor supports JavaScript with a bit better documentation and some examples. I think there's great potential with JavaScript here for at least giving the option for having some programming code for making decisions, like the publisher of Pathi Grundlag, has options for making decisions. If a document doesn't fit on one page, then skip it or stuff like that. And there's great potential, but it didn't have time, and the documentation is partly poor. So that's basically the problem. And just re-engineering the APIs or the functionalities or the features is sometimes a bit hard.
Okay, thank you very much.